I'm doing a series of articles at the American Spectator, which you can see at spectator.org. They're on American despotism. How did the system get to the mess it's in today? Why do we have so many people willing to be anti-American, willing to develop a new anti-white racism, willing to do all the things that are destroying American education? And so I've gone back to the beginnings, looking at the period after World War II, looking at the 1960s, and developing an approach to gradually, as a historian, not as a politician, but as somebody who was trained originally and has a Ph.D. in history, to develop an understanding of the patterns which led to where we are. And this is the fourth of those, an article which I've done, which you can see at spectator.org, on the role of civil rights in the 1960s. And I think some conservatives will find it a little disconcerting, because let's be clear, segregation was horrible. Segregation guaranteed that African Americans could not lead full lives. Segregation used the power of the government in states across the South to coerce people into having limited lives. And when the government wasn't aggressive enough, there were white supremacy organizations which between 1880 and 1950 committed over 3,500 lynchings. There were examples where people could be killed for looking the wrong way. And I think it's important to understand that these things were real and that the civil rights movement has to be seen in the context of that reality. Now, what had happened was gradually, people who had left the South, African Americans who had left the South, were significantly freer in the North. There was still a lot of de facto segregation, but it was not legal segregation. There was still a lot of prejudice, but they had fuller lives. And gradually after World War II, the number of African Americans who served in the military made it a little bit tricky to come back home and have the level of legal racist segregation that we had. Gradually, that was beginning to change things. It was changing things in sports. It was changing things in business. It was changing things in the news media. And it was changing things in politics. The breakpoint that was really decisive was the 1954 Supreme Court decision in Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education, in which the Supreme Court overruled an 1892 provision in Plessy versus Ferguson that said you could be separate but equal. And the Supreme Court decided in 1954 that that's nonsense, that separate had consistently meant that black schools, black neighborhoods, black rules were always inferior. And in fact, in most southern states, there were huge burdens against African Americans being able to vote. Ironically, in this entire period, it was the Republicans who were aggressively in favor of liberating the black community, and it was the Southern Democrats who were deeply, bitterly committed to maintaining segregation and maintaining white supremacy. As the struggle for civil rights continued, it laid down patterns that would come all the way to the present. A sense of the unfairness of government, particularly the state governments, a sense that the system moved too slowly, and it produced leaders of enormous capability. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., and if you have not read his letter from the Birmingham jail, I would recommend it highly. It's one of the great works in American history, and his explanation of the human cost of segregation, his explanation of why he was demonstrating and why he hoped through peaceful nonviolence to confront evil and to force change. It's truly a remarkable document. And King himself grew into a remarkable leader. As a very young man, he was a minister in Montgomery when there was a boycott. 90% of the riders on the Montgomery city bus system were African American. But there was a rule that blacks had to stand if a white wanted their seat. And they decided, since they were 90% of the customers, that here was a target that if they boycotted it, they would have decisive economic impact. The result was that the boycott lasted over a year. It was extraordinarily successful. The black community organized. For example, taxi drivers agreed that they would take you where you were going for the same price as a bus fare. And so there was a constant effort. And people like Walter Reuther of the United Auto Workers sent $55,000 to help pay for the boycott. The result was, over the course of a year, the bus company was being broken, and the United States federal court stepped in and said they could not anymore enforce segregation on public buses. It was an enormous breakthrough, and Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. was the key leader in developing it, and his career grew from there, and his sense of being a national leader grew. The key thing to remember about the civil rights movement, and I will contrast it later when the next article we're developing, which is on Black Power. The key difference was the civil rights leaders wanted to be American. The civil rights leaders basically are arguing that our Declaration of Independence, where we say that we are all endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that has to apply to African Americans too. They're arguing that the Constitution and the rights granted on the Constitution have to apply to African Americans too. So in a sense, the civil rights movement, while it was disruptive, and remember, they were taking head on the entire fabric of Southern white power across the region. And they were forcing changes which were frightening, which were difficult, which were angering, and people didn't give up power easily. Ultimately, it took massive public opinion changes. It took a sense in the North that it was just intolerable, for example, to have police dogs attacking children in Birmingham, which ended up as the cover of a national magazine. And people said, no, this is all wrong. And the result was that there were federal laws beginning to be passed for the first time since the Republicans had passed civil rights laws in the 1870s. The long stretch from the last civil rights law of 1876 to the beginning of civil rights legislation in the 1950s, supported by President Eisenhower, also a Republican. The result was gradually federal laws began to expand that said, we're going to enforce the law. And one of the key moments came when the courts ordered that the Little Rock, Arkansas schools would be integrated. The governor, Orval Faubus, was opposed to it, stood firmly with the segregationists. And President Eisenhower sent in elements of the 101st and 82nd Airborne and insisted that Faubus get out of the way and that the students be allowed to come to school. It was a tense, difficult, and a decisive moment. So throughout this period, you see confrontation with authority, you see nonviolent efforts, you see a demand for what is an enormous change, and you see a country having to examine its own conscience and then having to ask the question, so how far do we have to go? This will lead ultimately to other developments. But the key thing to remember was that in the civil rights period, what you had was an effort to integrate America, not to separate it, an effort to make sure that the American people would fulfill the Constitution and fulfill the Declaration of Independence. And that's why it was so vitally important. Click on the link in the description below to read my piece in the American Spectator. Christmas is coming, and it's never too early to think about what would make the perfect gift for your children or grandchildren. This Christmas, I recommend you order Ellis the Elephant 7-book series and Plush toy from our Gingrich 360 store. Ellis the Elephant teaches children lessons of America's founding and what makes our country exceptional. It's the perfect Christmas gift for little patriots. Order your 7-book series and Plush toy today by going to gingrich360.com/store. That's gingrich360.com/store. My new book, March to the Majority, is now a bestseller and is available at Amazon and Barnes & Noble and retailers everywhere. Get it today by clicking on the link in the description below.